Good afternoon and welcome to the kickoff event of the project EUTEx, developing a European framework for disengagement and reintegration of extremist offenders and radicalized individuals in prison, including returning foreign terrorist fighters and their families. I want to welcome and especially thank our speakers and special guests, Dr. Alma Zadic, Minister of Justice of the Republic of Austria, our keynote speaker, Professor Andrew Silk, and also our panelists, whom I will introduce a little bit later more in detail. Thank you also all of you in the audience who joined us today in such troubling times for Europe. On the evening of 2nd of November 2020, we who work in the field of radicalization and de-radicalization experienced a distinct feeling of failure. We failed to prevent a man from killing 4 people and injuring many more. Preventing terrorism is not easy. To paraphrase an IRA statement, you have to be lucky all the time. We only have to be lucky once. We won't be successful every time, yet, and maybe even because of this, we have to fight for every single case. Disengage, reintegrate every single terrorist and extremist, as this is the only way to prevent further harm. Today, we meet to talk about a project that unites practitioners, policymakers, and researchers in the common effort to make disengagement and reintegration work better. Sharing and working together in Europe is our strength, and we need to capitalize on this. All over Europe today, we have thousands of imprisoned terrorists and extremists. So not just people convicted for terrorism, but also other kinds of crimes connected to extremism, such as the Verbotsgesetz in Austria and other kinds of politically motivated criminality. We have new challenges, such as rising numbers of radicalized persons in prison. And in this case, recidivism is, of course, a particular challenge because although terrorists tend to be tend to recidivize less than other criminals, when they do, it is a particular harm to society. Furthermore, we have the thorny issue of transition management between prison and probation, prison and basically going back to normal life. And of course, the multi-agency cooperation, which we know is very important, but doesn't always work. Finally, we have the new challenge of returning women and children, whom you can see on the slide are quite numerous from the EU currently in the camps in northern Syria. What do we do in EUTEx? EUTEx really collects, evaluates best practices because we have some, of course, in the EU by now. We create course modules and we train practitioners in prison and probation, but also other types of authorities involved in this work. And we actually implement this in concrete cases. And of course, we want to disseminate this work all over the EU so that also other countries who are not representing the consortium can benefit from this work. The kinds of solutions that we offer are really very much focused on risk assessment, disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration in practice. So we don't just collect best practices, but we look to see what works, where, when, and with whom, because there is, of course, always a certain amount of difference depending on the national context. We overview them, we also evaluate them, and we try to implement them as well in practice. We also want to increase the capacity and professionalism of practitioners in the various institutions, in that we don't just convey theoretical knowledge, but we do practical exercises, we do simulations of real-life scenarios, on-the-job training, and a number of innovative methods. Finally, we want to establish cooperation protocols, which are so important among individuals, practitioners, authorities working in the field of security and social care. Finally, I want to introduce you to our consortium, whom we picked really, really carefully to make sure that we get the utmost competence in the various areas that we're looking at. So we're looking at, as I said, radicalization, risk assessment, disengagement, reintegration, but also the very specific issues of women and children and work with communities, reason for which we have partners also outside the EU. We have 2 partners from Kosovo, Partners Kosovo and the Ministry of Education, who have been very much involved in the work with women so far and children, and the Institute for Democracy and Mediation, who have been very much involved in the work with communities. We also have University of Paris, specialized on psychiatry and psychology, and the work with individuals in prison in these areas. We have Innovative Prison Systems from Portugal, who are specialized on online courses and trainings. We have Transform from Sweden, who is specialized on reintegration, and equally also European Strategies Consulting. And these two partners are also, in a way, our direct connection to the Radicalization Awareness Network, in particular the working group on rehabilitation. We have from Germany the Senate for Justice and Constitution, who have really very much experience, a lot of experience in implementing reintegration, disengagement in prisons. And we have, of course, the Real Instituto Elcano, who are also extremely experienced in the work on radicalization and creating courses. And last but not least, we have a number of partners from Austria, the Ministry of Justice and the Directorate of Prisons in particular, but also Neustadt, who is the probation partner and the main probation actor actually in Austria, who also have a number of good experiences, in particular the Social Net Conference. And finally, Senor and the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, who are basically coordinating this project and making sure that everything works well, and dissemination is also there. Now, after this introduction, I would like to introduce our special guest, our guest of honor, who is Dr. Alma Sadic, Federal Minister of Justice of the Republic of Austria. She was a member of the Austrian Parliament and previously worked as a lawyer in an international law firm in Vienna. Furthermore, she worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and the International Organization for Migration, and was a research scholar at the Harriman Institute at the Columbia University. She completed her doctoral studies in law at the University of Vienna and a postgraduate degree at Columbia University in New York, USA. She has also been very much engaged in the reforms after 2020, and we were very, very grateful to have her as minister, and we're pleased to listen to her opening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to give today's opening statement at this kickoff event on disengagement and reintegration of extremist offenders and radicalized individuals in prisons. A project that I, as the Minister of Justice of Austria, welcome and also very much support. Successful social reintegration of offenders is of great importance for the returning individuals themselves, as well as the society as a whole. As a central objective of a modern criminal justice system, the task of reintegration is as important as it is challenging. The penal system cannot erase the offender's past or experience that have influenced the person, but it can support offenders to develop skills, attitudes, and behaviors that will help them to stay out of prison and ideally become responsible members of their communities. Prisoners are, of course, part of the society. Almost every offender will be released eventually. Successful reintegration, therefore, is a means of reducing re-offense and preventing future crimes is therefore very important and thus in all our interest. Rehabilitation and reintegration activities should start as soon as possible following the prisoner's admission. One crucial tool of reintegration is education. Entering the job market as quickly as possible and therefore securing an economic livelihood for oneself is an essential prerequisite for social reintegration. In addition to training programs, therapeutic treatment and support is fundamental to address the root causes of criminal behavior. Only a penal system that places reintegration at the center of its activities will also protect the society in the long term. What I have just mentioned with regard to rehabilitation and reintegration applies to all offenders. However, reintegration in particular is particularly important in the case of extremists and terrorist offenders. Violent extremism and terrorism shakes up the entire society. The damages and the trauma caused are enormous. This is true for the victims and their relatives, and also for the community at large. As these crimes, they aim to disturb the social cohesion and they create a climate of insecurity. On November the 2nd, in 2020, Austria directly experienced the immense suffering caused by a terrorist attack. Successful reintegration also requires perspectives for offenders after their imprisonment, not only but especially in the case of extremist and terrorist offenders. These offenders are very often young adults who have been confronted with marginalization, stigmatization, and a particular lack of prospect in their lives, and are therefore a very easy target. This can make them very easy prey to the recruitment techniques of terrorists and also of terrorist networks, which offer putative support and recognition through ideologies that oppose core democratic values and deeply glorify violence. And the goal must therefore be to encourage offenders to question these ideologies and gradually distance themselves from them in exchange for becoming a welcome part of an open and liberal society. The basis of any cooperation aimed at achieving this is respectful interaction and the maintenance of normality as far as possible, also during imprisonment. Very important and crucial actors in this entire penal system are de-radicalization experts. They can help to reduce and identify possible radicalization processes. Pastoral counselors also make a very important contribution in this respect. Moreover, theoretically sound and practically proven risk analysis tools provide the necessary assistance to the actors involved. Multi-professionalism and cooperation is therefore key for dealing with those offenders. Thus, also correctional services are carried out in a multi-professional setting, including psychologists, social workers, prison staff, and external experts. This is a broad approach that guarantees in the broadest possible view, and individual cases can also guarantee some success. The measures taken in the penal system must continue to have an effect also after imprisonment. It's not enough to have an effect during imprisonment, but they need to be long-lasting and need to carry out after imprisonment. And therefore, it's very important to provide so-called follow-up support for these individuals as they transition into a life in liberty and as they re-enter their old communities. As Minister of Justice, it is particularly important for me to focus on the group of terrorist and extremist offenders. I therefore have ensured that the coordination unit dedicated to the prevention of extremism and de-radicalization has been set up with our Directorate General for the Prison Service to ensure the best possible flow of information between all parties involved. I think this one is the key and was one of the key learnings after the terrorist attack in Austria, in Vienna. The information that is out there needs to flow as quickly as possible. This coordination unit that I've set up also ensures cooperation among the relevant authorities, both external authorities, but also internal authorities. Key instruments for this cooperation are the so-called case conferences, which we have now prescribed by law, where both the judicial authorities and the state protection authorities, but also intelligence units can take part to analyze cases with multi-professional frameworks. In the case of pending conditional release conferences can be convened, especially if suspicion of radicalization arises during imprisonment, because we know that radicalization also can occur during imprisonment. That's why it's so important that after a conditional release, we have these release conferences where all actors can come together and discuss whether this person can be conditionally released. Radicalization and extremism are phenomena that occur across borders, and transnational cooperation and seamless information flows among all relevant actors and EU member states is therefore really essential and also a major issue in EU policy. Also, networking and exchange of best practices and new findings between practices, between research and policy is crucial for if we want to adopt effective measures, in particular in such sensitive area when we are dealing with the disengagement and reintegration of extremist offenders and radicalized individuals in prison. In this sense, I'm very grateful for this conference to take place because it helps to provide this necessary change. Therefore, I wish you a very enriching discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zadic, for this welcome address. And I'm very grateful that you mentioned a number of issues that we also have included in our project that really are priorities at the European level, not just at national levels, such as the need to have multi-professionalism, transnational cooperation, transition management, also cooperation among relevant authorities. And these case conferences are definitely one of the best practices that we want to also export in other countries. At this point, I would like to, first of all, thank you very much for your support. We will keep you updated on the progress of the project. I understand, of course, as a minister, you have a very busy schedule. We're actually very grateful that you made the time to join now before Easter. We hope to see you again at one of our events over 1.5 years of our project. Thank you very much. I will now go on to introduce our next guest, Professor Andrew Silk, whom I have known for a long time and appreciate as a scholar, and actually the entire consortium has voted to have you as a keynote speaker. You hold a chair in terrorism risk and resilience at Cranfield University. Professor Silk has a background in forensic psychology and criminology and has worked both in academia and for government. His primary research interests include terrorism, conflict, crime, and policing, and he is internationally recognized as a leading expert on terrorism, de-radicalization, and prisons. He is the editor, I'm just mentioning a couple of publications of which you have so many, the editor of Prisons, Terrorism, and Extremism, Critical Issues in Management, Radicalization, and Reform. He has authored chapters, and his publications include Risk Assessment of Terrorist and Extremist Prisoners, Reoffending by Released Terrorist Prisoners, Separating Hype from Reality, or the Phoenix Model of Disengagement, De-radicalization from Terrorism and Violent Extremism. This is only a very short introduction because we have a short online meeting. I will now give you the floor for the keynote speech, and afterwards I encourage, or even during, I encourage the audience to post questions in the chat function of YouTube, which we will collect and then address to our speakers. Andrew, you have the floor.
Daniela, thank you very much, and thank you to EUTEx for the invitation to join today. It's a great privilege to be able to talk on this. It's nice as well. I don't often agree with government ministers a lot, but in fairness, I agree with a huge amount of what the minister has just said, and I think she did flag all of the serious issues that we're grappling with in this arena right now. And I think what's happening in Austria is actually quite progressive in this area, and I welcome both that and EUTEx as an initiative, and I wish you all the success. My own background is both in academia, but also working in terms of risk assessment in relation to terrorists and violent extremists in prison settings. I've been grappling with those issues for a very, very long time. And an example I often flag when I give these type of talks dates from my very first prison visit, which was back in Ireland in the mid-90s. And this was a prison visit to Cork Prison, which is a medium-sized prison in the Irish prison estate, and it's meant for low and medium risk prisoners. And in Ireland, like a number of other countries, terrorist prisoners are concentrated in a high security prison. So they're not distributed among the prison population. They're held in Portlaoise, which is where high security prisoners are maintained. And during this prison visit to Cork, I got to see some cells, and in one cell, the wall was plastered with IRA propaganda and IRA paraphernalia, posters and slogans and images, all associated with the IRA. And I was very surprised at this. And I spoke to the staff afterwards, and I said, how come that prisoner isn't in Portlaoise? Why is he in Cork? Why is he in a medium secure facility when basically all of that stuff was up on his wall? And the staff were clearly not too bothered. And they said, he's not the real thing. He's just a wannabe. And from their perspective, he wasn't an IRA member, and he wasn't part of the organisation, and he wasn't something that they were concerned about. It's always struck me when moving forward into the noughties and then more recently, if other prison estates would have displayed a similar level of sang-froid with regard to Islamist or far-right extremists who were displaying similar insignia and signs and labels and all the rest in the walls of their cell, and I suspect not. I think one of the lessons that taught me very early on is that context matters, and it matters enormously. And in the context of the Irish prison system at that time, the staff understood that if he was serious, he wouldn't be in Cork. He would have been in Portlaoise. And he would have requested to be moved there, and under the arrangements in Ireland, that would have been approved, and he would have been shifted. And a similar type of dynamics exist in Northern Ireland today, very distinctively compared to a lot of European countries. I think when we look at the challenges that we face in relation to terrorists in prison settings and what happens to them after their release, I think the problems that we're dealing with are very old problems. They've been around for an extremely long time, and they're the type of problems that prison systems and probation systems have grappled with over the last 50 or 60 years. I think the advantage we have is that our level of knowledge and insight and capabilities that we have today over the last 10 years is transformational compared to what was available in the 80s, 90s, and even in the opening decade of this century. And we have seen a real transformation both in the knowledge, but also in terms of practice, in terms of our understanding of this population, what potential interventions may work with them, how risk can be assessed, and how it can be managed, and then beginning to think in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that are posed in relation to reintegration. Now, for me, in terms of the academic perspective that I look at, I think fundamentally, when we look at terrorism studies, there are two core questions. And these are the questions that we've been grappling with as a field for the last 60, 70 years in terms of an organised matter. Number one is, why do people become involved in terrorism and violent extremism? And this is the fundamental question. Every other question is second to this, but this is the fundamental one. We talk about this today in terms of radicalisation. And we talk about a radicalisation narrative and a radicalisation process. We look at the factors which cause people becoming involved in terrorism or violent extremism as connected to radicalisation. Now, radicalisation as a term has its own problems and has baggage with it, but it's there, it's established, it's now the dominant framework, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. But this is the number one question. Why do certain people become involved? In particular, there's a major problem in relation to what we refer to as the specificity question. And that's essentially that many people are exposed to radicalisation factors, but very few become radicalised to violence. And one of the key questions that we're still grappling with today is what is it about the individuals who become radicalized to violence that is different compared to the many others who apparently come from very similar backgrounds and are exposed to very similar environments, but do not make that progression. So that's one question. Now, the second question is connected to it, but is not exactly the same. And this is, why do people cease involvement in terrorism and violent extremism? And I use the term cease involvement quite deliberately, because one of the challenges we have in this arena is the distinction between de-radicalization and disengagement. And in my writing and in many other the writings of many others in this area, there is a distinction between these two elements. Disengagement refers at a basic level from behaviorally disengaging, desisting from involvement in offending. It does not make any claims about your attitudes, your ideologies, or your beliefs. It's simply about behavior. Whereas when we talk about de-radicalization, we are referring to more psychological belief and ideological processes where we're talking about not simply a change of behavior, but a change in mindset. In some contexts, governments and others can use the terms interchangeably. I don't. I prefer to keep them distinct, and I think it helps us to keep them distinct because I suspect there are different processes involved to an extent with them. But a key question is, what facilitates this? What facilitates movement away from active involvement in terrorism and violent extremism to leaving it behind? And this is obviously an important question for us. It can be tempting to assume that the factors that are involved in disengagement and de-radicalization are the same factors that are involved in radicalization. But the evidence at the moment suggests that that is not entirely the case. And it's more likely that this is a related but separate process. And so the reasons why people become involved in terrorism and violent extremism are not necessarily the reasons why they leave. Now, this is a challenge for us. And I think it's a challenge that we face in a number of different ways and different perspectives. Daniela, I'll just flag out, I'm Irish, I could talk all day long, so I'm going to be looking to you to basically kind of, say, no, you need to stop now. But I'll keep going on the various topics. Now, one way in which it's a challenge, and I hope we get into this in the questions, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion afterwards as well, is around risk assessment. This is something that the Minister has raised, and rightly so. And I think risk assessment of terrorist and violent extremists is something where we have seen genuine transformation in the last 10 years compared to where we were back in 2009, 2010. We were relying, by and large, on existing risk assessment tools that were designed and normally used for other types of offenders, and we were trying to apply them in relation to terrorist and violent extremists. And there was a recognition that these tools were not ideal, and that's being generous. In many cases, they were deeply flawed in terms of their use in relation to terrorist and violent extremists. And I'll give the most obvious example. Recidivism. And this has been flagged already. Daniela has already drawn our attention to the fact that recidivist rates for terrorist and violent extremist offenders are low. And they're very low. They're shockingly low. If the rest of the prison system had rates as low as these individuals do, we would be out of business. On average, currently, studies suggest it's about 5%. And that's over a relatively generous period of time. That's incredibly low when we compare it to other offender types. In the UK uses a risk assessment framework known as OASIS. And OASIS is an actuarial risk assessment tool, which essentially analyzes past reoffending rates for released prisoners, and then it applies it to current prisoners who are within the system and being considered for release or for risk. And it tends to score prisoners as quite high in terms of likelihood of reoffending. Typically within a 2-year frame, it will be, depending on the offence, it will average between 40 to 50%, which is standard enough likelihood of reoffending upon release. And when you put terrorist offenders into that system, it gives you a 40 to 50% reoffending rate for them as well. We know in practice that the rate is nowhere near that high for these types of offenders in the England and Wales prison system. It tends to be about 3.7%. So it's tiny compared to the average. And there was a recognition back in 2010, both in England and Wales and elsewhere in the world, that the existing risk assessment tools and the existing risk assessment frameworks were not fit for purpose when it came to these types of offenders, and that something else was needed. And what we have seen since that period has been the development of a number of what can now well-established risk assessment tools, in particular VERA 2R, which is used in a number of European countries, and I also personally highly rate the ERG 22+, which is in use in England and Wales, but not in use anywhere else. Now, having said that, I rate them both. One of the issues with them is when we look at the factors that they are examining, a lot of the factors that both ERG 22 and VERA 2R are looking at radicalization factors. So these are the factors connected to individuals becoming involved in terrorism and violent extremism. And there are a range of factors which have been identified in the literature and in the research over the last 20 years connected to this. Some meta-analysis have flagged potentially 400 or more factors connected to radicalization processes. Now, VERA 2R and ERG don't look at that many, but they do look at a substantial number. But a lot of it is pitched in terms of initial radicalization, those types of factors. And relatively little is pitched in terms of disengagement and de-radicalization factors. VERA 2R is better than ERG. But by and large, there is an emphasis on the factors which have been associated with individuals becoming involved in terrorism and violent extremism, and not necessarily on factors which are associated with individuals remaining involved, and then crucially, individuals leaving behind their involvement in terrorism and violent extremism. And I think it's this life cycle approach to understanding terrorism and violent extremism is something that potentially we're going to need to focus more attention on as we go forward. Danielle flagged one piece of work which I completed with John Morrison and a team of researchers at Royal Holloway, University of London last year, and that was the Phoenix model of disengagement and de-radicalization from terrorism and violent extremism. And the Phoenix model is based on a systematic review of the research on disengagement and de-radicalization in recent years. And when we were conducting that systematic review, 11 factors emerged, or 11 themes emerged in the literature which stood out for us. And these themes, as we assessed them, struck us that there was a model in here in terms of understanding how these people were moving away from terrorism and what the factors were which were either encouraging this or facilitating it in some shape or form. And one of the key things which struck us was that the factors which are important in this regard were not necessarily factors in relation to radicalization initially. And I'll give you an example of that, one that's particularly topical in a lot of the debates around radicalization at the moment, and that relates to mental health. I've written on mental health and terrorism for a very, very long time, and it is a debate which has ebbed and flowed as the years have passed, and it's currently in an upward trajectory in terms of the potential role that mental health plays in radicalization, but a lot of attention being focused on issues around neurodiversity and a range of other potential impacts of mental health, increasing vulnerability to radicalization. We're not really here to talk about that today, but when we look at the disengagement and de-radicalization literature, we also see that mental health can play a role in this process as well, but it's mental health in a different way. It is not neurodiversity, it is not in relation to depression or some other psychological disorders. Rather, it's mental health in terms of stress and burnout. And the evidence was showing that stress and burnout, just as they can affect many occupations and many individuals in a range of environments, also plays a role for individuals involved in terrorism and violent extremism, and that this becomes a factor. The longer that they are active in the organisation, that they are involved in campaigns of violence, the more stress that builds in relation to this, and the more instances of burnout that you see. This can become a factor in terms of their incentives and motivation to leave this behind. Some of the good news in relation to the discussions we're having today, which emerged from this, was one key factor which emerged was the role of prison. Prison is often pitched as a university of terror or as a hotbed of radicalisation, where vulnerable inmates are highly likely to be radicalised to a range of extremist ideologies. And prison is often pitched in that regard, and is often in much government policy, the perspective views it within those terms. Now, what the research indicated, however, is that that may be true in certain contexts, but for the vast majority of terrorists and violent extremists who end up in prison, prison is actually an environment where change is possible and where change happens. The vast majority of terrorist and violent extremist prisoners experience change while they are in prison. It is a period of reflection, and it is, for most, a period of transformation. Now, that's not always a popular thing to say, and I've been in front of many government committees who haven't been happy to hear that at all. I'd make a lot more money if I said that prison was a hotbed of radicalisation and all prisoners were dangerous and extremist ideologies were rampant inside prisons. But in contrast, when we look at the actual terrorist offenders, individuals who go in with a conviction for terrorism or violent extremism, what we find there is that the dominant story and the dominant narrative is one of change. It is one of change which happens, and crucially, it's one change which happens regardless almost of what we do with them. Another piece of good news in relation to the Phoenix model is interventions with these types of offenders. And the good news at the moment is that most interventions report at least some positive impacts with most prisoners. It is almost the case of everything works. It doesn't matter what you do, you're probably going to see some positive impacts with most of these offenders. Again, that's not necessarily a popular thing to say, but it's an encouraging thing to say at this point in time. Now, key element in relation to that is how do you define change and what factors are you assessing change on, because this makes a big difference. One of the key problems we have in relation to, well, I'll say it's a problem, but it's a nice problem to have, is that recidivism is so low. If you're dealing with a recidivist rate on average of about 5 to 6% for this population, it means that most offenders, when they are released, will not reoffend. And so this poses a challenge in terms of trying to measure what works in terms of interventions within prison and in terms of management approaches after release, because we're dealing with a small number of reoffenders compared to the population overall. So this raises a question. Is the reoffending rate low because the management that we place on terrorist and violent extremist prisoners is more thorough, more sophisticated, and more intensive compared to what is used in relation to other types of offenders? Is it because the risk assessment models that we use and frameworks that we use for these types of offenders are more sophisticated, more accurate than the versions that we use in relation to other types of offenders? Or is it because terrorist and violent extremist offenders are different? They are characteristically different compared to the average prison population. Now, my gut instinct on this, in terms of the evidence that is available at the moment, is that it's primarily because they are different, and not necessarily because we have hit on remarkably effective solutions in relation to interventions, management, and risk assessment. I'm not knocking the risk assessment. I think we really have come on massively in risk assessment over the last 10 years, but we still have a way to go. I think the Phoenix model also flagged an additional final element in terms of disengagement and de-radicalisation from terrorism, and that was reintegration. And again, in relation to the work of EUTEx, I absolutely think it is correct and important to focus on reintegration in relation to these offenders. The points made by the Minister in relation to the challenges that exist for this group are absolutely correct. I'm completely on board with what she's said in relation to employment and in relation to education and in relation to providing opportunities like these to offenders, all offenders, upon release in order to maximise the chance of reintegration. I think terrorist offenders, it's no surprise, experience serious problems when it comes to reintegration, particularly in a context where, as is certainly is the case with many of the Islamist inspired offenders, where you cannot acknowledge your offence back in society after you've been released, and where people simply don't want to employ a former terrorist in an organisation, or are reluctant about letting a former terrorist onto a course or taking part in education, and a whole range of challenges and obstacles face these individuals when they are released. Successful reintegration is absolutely key. If we can manage this, we can prevent the type of attacks which have taken place in recent years in a number of European cities from occurring. I think one of the challenges we have is in relation, again, to the research that needs to be carried out in this question. And I think I talked earlier about the specificity problem in relation to radicalisation. Why do so few people who seem to be exposed to radicalising factors become involved in terrorism and violent extremism? And we have an opposite problem in relation to reoffending. Why do so few reoffend? Why do we not have higher reoffending rates for released terrorists and violent extremists in Europe compared to what we currently see? What's the rationale behind that? What's the explanation for why individuals such as Usman Khan and Sudesh Ahmad, who were responsible for the attacks in London in 2019 and 2020, and others such as the attack in Vienna, which has already been flagged, what was different about these individuals compared to the much larger group of terrorist offenders who have been released, who have not reoffended? And I think this is a fundamental question that's facing this area right now. What is it that was distinctive about these individuals compared to their compatriots? And can we identify what was different in relation to them and use this in terms of risk assessment and risk management? And I think this, for me, is a key question. But the good news, I feel, is that we are in a better place to answer this question today than we would have been at any time in the past 50 years. And one of the reasons for this is certainly, if we look at it in a European context, most terrorist offenders, when they are released in Europe today, have been risk assessed. Whether that is through a system like ERG 22+, VERA 2R, or something similar, there has been a formalised risk assessment framework used to assess them, and usually carried out by a qualified and trained prison psychologist or other staff, and that we have this population of assessments available to us in terms of doing an analysis on the ones who ultimately reoffend versus the ones who don't. And in a way, we've got raw material to work with to help answer this question. It simply wasn't available 10 years ago. And I know that a variety of countries are beginning to grapple with this problem right now. And I would expect that within the next 5 to 10 years, our understanding of this question will have transformed compared to where it is right now. And we will understand a lot more about the reoffenders compared to our current position, which is quite poor. Now, I'm conscious of time. I'm happy to pause at this point and take some questions if that suits, or I'm looking to you, Danielle. Do you want me to continue further, or stop now?
No, that's actually that's perfect timing. Very rare in the academic world. So, thank you very much, first of all, for pointing out these things and also the importance of research. I think it's also clear again that, you know, the academic world, policy world, the practitioners world are not so different. In fact, I think we agree on many things. I was also very much stimulated by your approach to risk assessment. We are also going to deal with this in our project, and we are actually thinking whether to use an existing tool or actually develop a new one based on existing ones. And I think your point about looking more about factors that determine disengagement rather than the ones having determined radicalization is a very, very good point. Because what we want to do is not risk assess the possibility of radicalization, but in fact of disengagement. We actually also have a question. I want to also encourage others to post questions in the chat function of YouTube. Also during the upcoming conversation, here comes the question. Do you think there will ever be a significant change in regard to the mental health aspect of the risk assessment process? For instance, distinguishing between neurodiversity and mental illnesses?
Yeah, I think that is a really critical question. I think there's a bit of movement already in relation to that. Up until very recently, neurodiversity was simply encamped within mental health, and I think that was a mistake. And I think it is beginning to be corrected now. And I think as we go forward, and particularly as we see new versions of ERG and presumably of VERA2 or eventually that comes out as well, we will see neurodiversity disentangled from mental health, and I think that is appropriate. I think we need to be nuanced in terms of how we look at mental health in relation to this population. And again, this is one of those issues where we do need to distinguish between radicalization on the one side and what are the risk factors there and vulnerabilities there, and then disengagement and de-radicalization on the other side, where again, as the Phoenix model flagged, mental health means different things in that context compared to the radicalization side.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed with the panel, but I trust you will remain with us, and in case there's other questions for you. Sometimes it needs a bit of time for people to digest the input, so that's why we're going to move on now, also given the time and the agenda. But I will collect questions afterwards for everyone. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Just perhaps as a background, we have a number of speakers in this panel. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, so very short inputs, after which there will be a discussion, and we will also address questions from the audience. First one, again, a very dear friend of mine, Professor Anita Peresin, who is Senior Advisor in Croatia's Office of the National Security Council, and has served as a guest lecturer at the George C. Marshall Europe Center for Security Studies and the NATO Center of Excellence in Ankara, Turkey. As an assistant professor at Zagreb University, her research is focused on terrorism and security analysis, with particular attention to women and children in terrorism. She published widely on the strong participation of women in ISIS and the relevance of their strategic and operational contribution to the effectiveness of the organization. Anita, you have the floor.
Of course, that I forgot. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I will talk about main challenges in working with women and children returnees from Syria and Iraq in EU countries and in the Western Balkans. In the last few years, the RAN organized several meetings where expert practitioners from different European countries discussed about early experience of dealing with returnees and reveal many challenges ranging from the management and organizational issues, skills and dedication needed by frontline practitioners to working with returnees, their families and local communities. There are various different perspectives in different countries, but professionals working with them agree that the following general approaches are essential to their engagement with returnees. A tailored approach for each returnee, establish coordination mechanisms across government agencies and multi-agency case management, immediate and long-term risk and needs assessment, and communication strategy, including the one at the local level that counter and prevent stigma, and conclusion. So following are the main challenges. I will start with how to find the balance between rehabilitation and the public safe, because a number of European countries consider the threat emanating from returnees to be significant, and the need to find the balance between their rehabilitation and the aim of public safe is essential. And therefore, the social and community context in which returnees arrive is an important factor to consider, because current experience shows that returnees are often excluded and stigmatized even by their own families and communities, which can, of course, obstruct their successful rehabilitation and reintegration and bring them back into the path of radicalization. Then, a lack of gender-sensitive programming. Women's involvement in violent extremism has tripled in the last 10 years, and women, together with children, represent the majority of those being returned or those still seeking repatriation. Many women will thus face a period of detention, and the gap in programs specifically designed for women in both the prison context and post-prison rehabilitation is a challenge that demands a prompt and systematic response. We have to be aware that women also face a double burden upon release from detention when they face a stigma of being a terrorist offender and of being a women offender, presenting additional gender-specific barriers to reintegration. Then risk assessment, already elaborated in detail by Andrew, so I will skip this part. I will just mention limited financial resources, since rehabilitation is costly, especially in the long term. Then prosecution. With regard to prosecution, generally EU member states do not differentiate between women and men. Women have recently been treated as individuals with full agency, meaning that they are not considered only as victims but also as perpetrators. In contrast, with the exception of Kosovo, women returnees in the Western Balkan region have not all faced jail time and received lower charges than men for participating in a terrorist group. Another challenge is what is the prospect for the future these women have. For example, female returnees to Western Balkans who were subject to our research expressed their satisfaction with how their repatriation had been handled, as well as with the services and care provided to them after returning home. And now the most pressing challenge for them is how to rebuild their lives, resocialize into their communities, gain economic independence, and secure a future for themselves and their children. The success of their reintegration will depend significantly on their legal status, whether they are prosecuted and jailed, and their economic prospects. But for these women, achieving this is a challenge for several reasons. For one, many suffer from serious psychological issues, including PTSD, which makes them incapable of holding employment, at least in the short term. Further, limited employment opportunities in their home countries make it difficult to find a job, especially for those stigmatized as returnees. And it is interesting that some women highlighted the impossibility of married women working without their husband's permission, which is not feasible to get from husbands who have not returned or are imprisoned abroad. Another challenge is how to work with child returnees, who are considered, of course, primarily victims, and psychological support in processing traumatic experience and securing normal life, both in the family environment and education, are paramount. Different countries have developed particular programs and procedures for dealing with child returnees, and they generally draw on existing institutions and approaches in the area of child protection, with trauma management as a key component of these approaches. Normalization of the children's everyday life is based on regular schooling and the adaptation to the domestic school system, and regular schooling is thus considered as one of the most vital components in the process of the child's reintegration and resocialization. However, the lack of official citizenship for children born in Syria and Iraq remains an issue that complicates their legal status and hamper their progress. Some countries are still seeking legal solutions to this problem. And a few recommendations for the end. Rehabilitation programs should begin as early as possible, and psychological teams should be included as early as possible. Long-term psychological support structure is essential, and not only for returnees, but also for their extended families. A trauma-informed approach is crucial to this work, and all relevant stakeholders should be trained to be trauma-informed and sensitive. Then it is important to use a tailored approach for children. The specific needs of each child depend on the level of trauma they experience in the war zone and after return, their age and gender, and the relationships they have built both in Syria and Iraq and with their extended family back home. Some experience demonstrates that trauma can be triggered in child returnees by ordinary seeming situations, and every such problem or scenario simply cannot be predicted and controlled, and thus support programming for schools on how to work with returnee children is recommended as a vital practice. And to conclude, rehabilitation is intended to be a long-lasting process, diverse and dynamic in scope, and this poses a challenge at different stages. And therefore, success requires the continuous exchange of lessons learned, good practices, and recommendations among professionals from different fields. The main gaps are related to gender sensitivity, assessment models for women and minors, trauma awareness, and staff training. And it is important to highlight that overcoming stigma and reintegrating returnees is not only the responsibility of communities. It is essential that individual returnees also take ownership of the success of their reintegration. So with this, I will conclude my brief presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anita, for pointing out these very important aspects, especially considering the relatively large number of women and children that still need to be repatriated. I mean, we're not only dealing with legal issues, but also the question of how do we use tools that have been primarily developed for men, actually, for male population. Before going to the next intervention, perhaps a short question. Given that you've mentioned those differences between, the treatment of women as perhaps different as to men, do you think it's an issue of, say, well, for women it's more a matter of being victims, or do we actually have women agency as well, or it depends? Very briefly.
Yes, of course, that we have to differentiate between genders. And it's a problem that all these assessment tools are tailored to men, are created to male offenders. But also there is a lack of programs, starting with rehabilitation programs still in prison, then the treatment of female offenders during imprisonment, and of course after release. So we have to really take into consideration that women have different needs, and that the rehabilitation process for women is quite different than those for men. And this is something that we have to tackle more seriously in the future if we want to increase the success of rehabilitation programs for women.
All right, thank you very much. More questions will follow, but for now I want to introduce our next speaker, Carola Garcia Calvo, who is also a member of our consortium, and she will offer us a European view, a EU bird's eye view on things. Carola is a doctor. Garcia Calvo is a senior analyst in the program on violent radicalization and global terrorism at the Elcano Royal Institute, and associate professor at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos, both in Madrid. Currently, she's also functional unit coordinator of the RAN Policy Support Project, aimed at supporting the European Commission to facilitate exchanges among policymakers across the EU. So basically, this is the policymakers' equivalent of the old and still existing RAN practitioners. Her research areas include terrorism and counterterrorism, violent radicalization in the Western world, preventing violent radicalization, de-radicalization strategies, programs, and policies. On this note, we are looking forward to your 5 minutes input.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for your kind presentation, Daniela, again. And it's my pleasure to be here today on behalf of Elcano Royal Institute, a think tank based in Madrid, Spain, but also as part of the RAN Policy Support Project and the EUTEx consortia. So yes, in the next 5 minutes, I will reflect and share with the audience some general ideas, very brief, on the topic of training for prison and probation staff in the European Union. The main source of information for this input was collected during the RAN PS virtual workshop organized by Elcano Royal Institute last November 2021, training for PCV in prisons and multi-agent cooperation, addressing needs for a better response, which gather information from 10 member states, including Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So at this point, and before I start with my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the work done by my colleagues Alvaro Vicente and Marta Driesen. Okay, so training on PCV for prison and probation staff has become a key pillar both in the European and national approaches against violent extremism across Europe, although the result is uneven. There are different stages of development in terms of, maybe Daniela, we can share now the slide I sent you while I speaking. So yes, we find differences in terms of goals, targets of training, level of the training, ideologies covered by training on multi-agency cooperation, the length of the training, the trainers, and also in terms of the evaluation. Regarding the goals of the training, provided for prison and probation staff and in the countries included in this presentation, we can see that all the member states included have dealt with the detention capacities, but just a few have developed training for reducing the risk of recidivism of violent extremist offenders and promoting their social reintegration. I will be back to this point later in my presentation, but I would like to have a look on this table also, for instance, in the ideologies covering the training provided in the member states, including this study, because it's true that in the last years, all the countries have included training covering jihadism, the ideology of Salafi jihadism, but just a few member states are covering different other ideologies as far right or far left, among other possibles. Also, it's interesting focus on the trainers, because for all the member states covered, they include the trainers are professionals for the prison administration, but again, just a few, and this is very interesting, just a few includes also trainers from the academia, researchers, or from the civil society organizations. Finally, in terms of the evaluation, it's also significant to point out that just a few members are countries included in the study are dealing with the evaluation, but not in terms of impact, but is an evaluation focused on the output of the program. So more efforts on evaluation should be done. So you can all. I will move forward. So thank you, Daniela, for sharing the slide. I think it's easier for the audience to have a look on the table. But now, trying to explain these differences in the stage of development regarding training for prison and probation staff among US member states, we should point out three main aspects. The first is the existence or not of a national framework or national CVE strategy. There is a great deal of diversity among member states regarding the adoption and effective implementation of such strategies. While a few have developed their national views over the time, which has allowed them to evaluate and to improve them, as is the case of Denmark and the Netherlands, for example, there are others, like Italy, that still lack of a national strategy. So in this regard, member states that have fully developed a national strategy document against violent extremism have approved and implemented a greater number of actions, including risk assessment tools, multi-agency collaboration, and of course, rehabilitation and reintegration programs. Another factor that should be pointed out to explain this diversity across Europe is the scope of the problem on its member states, of course. Because the degree of incidence of violent radicalization in prisons also differs significantly across Europe. In this context, the most affected countries, such as Belgium, for example, are far more concerned to act than others with lower percentage of violent extremist offender behind bars, like Greece. And finally, we should also consider the characteristic of each national penitentiary system that varies widely in terms of legal frameworks, resources, and capacities, as well as in terms of the socio-demographic characteristics of their prison population. Okay, finally, we get to the point of the specific training for rehabilitation and reintegration of violent extremist offenders. In this sense, just 3 out of 10 member states covered in the workshop that frames my today's intervention counts with a specific training for secondary and tertiary prevention within prisons, namely Denmark, the Netherlands, and partially Germany. So this is an identified gap. The former is coherent with the fact that the design, implementation, and evaluation of such programs is still a work in progress in the European Union. We have identified, as my colleague Daniela Pisoiu has pointed out in their welcome remarks, best practices and also promising practice, but we still need to deal with challenge in this regard. So this is because, and very brief, because the design of such initiatives is highly dependent on both the local context and the specific needs of the individuals to be rehabilitated and reintegrated. And this demands a case-to-case approach. This tailor-made approach makes it difficult to systematize such programs, as they are not easy neither to adapt nor to export to different realities. And last but not least, in this context, it's difficult to generate a proper corpus of literature and teaching materials similar to those already existing for the implementation of risk assessment tools, as BERA 2R, for instance. So train of trainers in this field is also a challenge. So I think that this is all for my part at this point, but of course I remain at your disposal for any question or comment that you have made. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Carola, for pointing out this very interesting picture of what is actually the status of training in Europe. And we can see the differences there and the work that needs to be done looking ahead. Whilst the people are pondering on this input, oh, actually, we have a question for you. So we will address this one first. So the question says, why is there so much emphasis on jihadism and not so much on other ideologies? I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, well, the emphasis in jihadism has risen in the last years, linked to the conflict in Syria and the intense jihadi mobilization within the European Union. We must not forget that the European Union is, in relative terms, one of the part of the world most affected by the jihadi mobilization linked with the conflict in Syria, the emergence of Islamic State, a new matrix of global terrorism, and the establishment of the caliphate in the Middle East in the summer of 2014. Now we have to manage the legacy of such an intense jihadi wave of mobilization, and this is because the interest in jihadism has risen in the last years. As you pointed out during the welcome remarks, the number of foreign fighters, the returnees from the Middle East are important within the European Union, but it's also true that the interest for the far right and far left are also risen in the last years within the European Union. The interest is also different depending on the threat that those ideologies are perceived by different countries. There are more interest in far left in member states like Italy, for instance, while the far right is more concerned for member states from Northern Europe. But and also, just as a final comment, I would like also to stress that also the other extremism are risen in the European Union, and member states are interested in anti-vax movements or disinformation and this kind of new trends in extremism that are not still very well differentiated, but all around the far right, are surrounding the far right. So yes, it's a complex, but it's a complex scenario nowadays within the European Union.
Indeed, an evolving situation with increasingly more actors actually joining the scene of interest, unfortunately.
Yeah. But of course, currently the threat coming from the jihadism is the main threat recognized by Europol and other authorities in Europe. So we should think about jihadism as the current main threat for the European Union.
Okay, thank you. We also have a question for Anita. The question is there any data or information on best experiences and practices for easy reintegration of the returned women into society, especially providing jobs for them?
Actually, yes. It is already proven that programs focused on supporting women to start their own job instead of start working for some company and institution is better for these women, because they still suffer many psychological issues and are not ready to fully resocialize in that sense. So that investing some money in helping them to start their own job is already proven to be effective in some countries, but we have to keep in mind that the rehabilitation, like radicalization, is a non-linear process, and that the individual moves through this process, and during this process it can change their minds and views and ideas. So it is very hard to say at this point what will be successful in the long term. But as I said, so far it seems that it is best to invest to help them to start their own job than to force them to work for the others.
That's a very interesting point. So not just providing occupation, but a particular type of occupation for women. Very interesting.
Yeah.
We also have a more technical question for Professor Silk about risk assessment. What do you think about the use of change-oriented tools such as the VRS, not only to assess risk, but also to set treatment goals?
Yeah, I think if we look at things like ERG and VR2R and how they are used in relation to terrorist and violent extremists, they absolutely are tied into treatment and interventions. The ERG is the one I have the most experience with. That is closely linked with the interventions that are available in England and Wales. And one of the elements of the ERG is that it can help identify offenders who are suitable for various interventions and what interventions might work with them. And I think the risk assessment tools do try to be dynamic, so that they try to recognize that risk changes and it can change and won't remain static. I think one of the challenges that you have, of course, is that some of the factors that they look at are static factors. So things like criminal history, it's fixed, it doesn't change. But others are much more dynamic, and you're trying to grapple with attitudes, ideologies, beliefs, and social dynamics and issues like that. But I think with the risk assessment, there is recognition it has to be dynamic. It has to be a dynamic approach. Whereas when you rely on things like OASIS, which are much more static and much more actuarial in orientation, it doesn't work as well. And it's one of the reasons why I think most of the risk assessment frameworks in relation to terrorism and violent extremism take a structured professional judgment in terms of how they tackle this problem. That's absolutely the right way to go.
Okay, we have more speakers, and I'm minding the time. I'm just going to address one more question, a really quick one, if somebody wants to take this up. It refers to the role of imams in prison. So is it appropriate to treat foreign fighters, to have them treated by imams in the field of radicalization, disengagement, and rehabilitation? Do we have a volunteer for this question?
I can take it from Sweden. I think experiences from Sweden is that they can play an important role, but there needs also to be a vetting process so that there is a control system. There have been examples of imams that have radicalized also inmates. So, and by this said, they can play a role, but still we need to have the vetting process. And this is the thing with all religious counseling, actually. you need to control that they actually can give counsel. So it's not specific due to Islam, it's also other religions that you need to have the skills of being a counselor, religious counselor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the initiative. Very much appreciated. We have 3 more inputs, actually, very brief, if possible, from Ms. Dervishi and from Carola and from Tom Adams. Ms. Dervishi, did you want to address this question as well?
Yes, Daniela, thank you very much. Hello to everyone, and apologize for the delay of the connection. To say the truth, in answering to this question, I shall present to you the model that Albania is using in the prisons. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Inter-Religious Council of Albania, where all the 5 religious authorities that are recognized from the Albanian government are represented. And every Friday, an authorized and vetted imam from the Directorate of Prisons and the Muslim Community Authority in Albania let's say, has contacts, makes sermons, and at the same time helps and advises people that share, let's say, Muslim religion. But at the same time, we have opened this opportunity also to other recognized religious authorities in order to enter the prison and probation spaces in order to talk with detainees or to help or support them while they are inside, or at the same time also with their families outside. We consider this very important and very perspicuous for their rehabilitation. Of course, I agree with Madam Elizabeth that they have to be vetted. In fact, in our case, they are vetted, because from this memorandum of understanding, we have a vetted list of people that enter in the prisons and probation space area. At the same time, we have made possible that, let's say, the literature that enters, the religious literature that enters the prison and probation space area might be, let's say, we cannot control or vet it, but let's say that it's checked up. And when we see that something, when I say we, that means the institutions and the frontliners that work with every day, it is seen that maybe something is strange or is not in line with the literature that the authorized religious authorities endorse. They call them, they consult them. It's just that they do not block this literature from entering the prison, but they consult them. And when everyone agrees that this literature, let's say, push people to violent radicalization or violent extremism, it doesn't enter, let's say, the prison system. If there will be any question more on that, I can also answer during my intervention, but let's say that in a nutshell, this is the Albanian experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We already see how we exchange best practices already in this panel. And it's great that the two ladies have offered to respond to this question, because they actually are next. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Ms. Elisabeth Modé, who is Senior Advisor at the Ministry of Justice, Unit for Crime Policy in Sweden. She is also a member of the Commission's network of national prevent policymakers. Since 2014, she has been responsible for preventive measures against violent extremism within the government offices. She also has knowledge and experience of working on national level with the prevention of honor-related violence and forced marriages, and with youth policy development. Ms. Modé has a master's degree in philosophy and history of ideas from the University of Stockholm. Elisabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you very much for inviting me to this kickoff. And I will speak briefly about the problems today, some of the work in Sweden, and the cooperation within the EU on this topic. So I would say that today we know more about the challenges we face. In theory, we know what we need to develop with cooperation, multi-agency, information sharing, etc. But still, we need to work together to identify best practices on how we can tackle these challenges. And I think this project, EUTEx, came just in time for such a development. So thank you for this. The study Prisons and Terrorism, Extremist Offender Management in 10 European Countries by Peter Neumann and Ryan Basra from King's College was published in 2020. And then the study provides a comprehensive analysis of the experiences from 10 member states. And as Adder has highlighted, I can repeat this again. There are now more inmates convicted for terrorism-related offences than at any point since the turn of the millennium within the EU. There is also variety in European countries, as there are great differences in the number of inmates convicted for terrorism. There are more variations in the group of extremist offenders. Some member states have an increased number of convicted women, and some member states have a growing violent right-wing extremist prisoner population. And inmates are serving a wider range of sentences, from 1 year to life sentences. This is also partly due to that member states have different legislation and what these inmates got convicted for: participation in a terrorist organization or for a war crime, for instance. The work in Sweden then, The Swedish Prison and Probation Service is a national agency under the Ministry of Justice. The agency manages all the prisons and probation offices in Sweden, a total of 45 prisons, 35 remand prisons, 34 probation offices, and 11,000 employees. There have been relatively few terrorist or foreign terrorist fighters convicted in Sweden, mostly due to that we still don't have a legislation against participation in a terrorist organization. In 2020, the total extremist offender population was 107 inmates, and 78 of those were connected to violent Islamist extremism, and 29 were connected to political extremism, mostly a violent right-wing extremism. The support from the government is important in order to develop the work in prisons, the preventive work in prisons. So in 2016, the Swedish government assigned the Swedish Prison and Probation Service to develop the agency's preventive work. And this has resulted in that there has been an improved education for staff. Since January 2017, the Swedish Prison and Probation Service has introduced educational modules on violent extremist milieus and radicalization processes in the introductory courses and security courses modules. The agency has also integrated the issue of violent extremism in digital training modules. The agency has improved coordination between municipalities and the probation services to ensure that there are no gaps when inmates are released. And there is increased research about risk assessment tools and also training for staff in using these models. As touched upon before, the agency has also developed a vetting process of religious leaders who are engaged to do work within prisons, and in this also develop their cooperation with the other agencies who have this knowledge. If staff have knowledge and also support from the prison and probation service, they will be better equipped to prevent violent extremism and develop concrete measures in the day-to-day work with inmates. And from an EU perspective, the Swedish Prison and Probation Service have important advantages in the development of measures, as it has its own research unit that also tests and develop models. It has its own internal intelligence, and it has also assignments about capacity building in third countries, as in prisons in Iraq or Somalia, which they can they pick out the bits and pieces which also can be used in Sweden. The work in prisons is also a priority issue on the EU level. So in 2018, when the European Commission strengthened the support to member states and provided us with opportunity to cooperate more closely with the challenge we face in the preventive work in a so-called project-based collaboration. This means that a group of member states can, with support from the Commission, discuss challenges, identify gaps, and if possible, deliver more knowledge and recommendations. So between 2019 and 2021, Sweden and France had a co-chaired project-based collaboration about the preventive work in prisons. Together with policymakers and prison staff from other member states and the recommendations from Peter Neumann and Ryan Bussar's study, we came up with some conclusions in the end of the project. First, prisons should not be a driver of radicalization. Risk management aim at providing a safe prison environment for prison staff, volunteers, contractors, and inmates. This shapes a good platform for the work with reintegration of all inmates of all kinds. So the preventive work, we need to prevent overcrowded prisons, provide prisons with enough staff, take initiatives to assess and adapt prison regimes, and support research and the development of evidence-based work and methods. Second, training of staff on all levels within the prison and probation system is a prerequisite. From day one, from intake through release, prison staff are required to assess and respond to a constantly changing mixture of inmate characteristics and needs. Thirdly, member states should support the development of a comprehensive approach to rehabilitation, disengagement and reintegration. Those works need to start in prisons and continue after release. Cooperation with intelligence, research and relevant local stakeholders is needed. Those convicted for terrorism can have criminal background, experience of drug dealing, organized crime, involvement in war crimes. This and other factors as drug addiction or different psychosocial issues need to be acknowledged in sentence planning, in the reintegration work, and also in the work to make them disengage from violence. And as Professor Silk highlighted before, I think the reintegration part is really hard due to that, who will then employ a person convicted for terrorism. So this is something we need to be working on, and I hope you can address in this project also. So I think, to conclude, I think that as a tool for taking these conclusions further, or all the knowledge we have comprehended right here and now, we must deepen the knowledge exchange between research, practice and policy making. And I think that your project, the EUTEx project, can be a platform for such a mix of competences. And I look forward to hear more about your findings in the near future. So with this, I say thank you and go back to you, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for making these very important points. And we definitely intend to build on the lessons learned and recommendations of previous projects, and we will keep you informed, and hopefully we can even increase the cooperation during this project. We have some questions, and I want to make sure that we actually manage to ask them. That's why I want to ask the next two speakers to really keep to 5 minutes. I'm going to introduce now our next speaker, who has already said something about imams, but also has her own input. Miss Lady Dervishi is currently Director of Coordination Center for Countering Violent Extremists, the CVE Center in Albania. In her previous job positions, she has been the head of the section for civil society and security in the CVE Center, as well as seconded expert to IOM, Tirana, on diaspora and migration for the government of Albania. She has a vast professional knowledge of international affairs and has attained her 3 second-level master's degrees in the field of international and diplomatic relations, security studies, and European studies, and is part of the Radicalization Awareness Network of the European Commission since July 2020. Lady, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniela, and thanks again for the invitation. We are really happy that this EUTEx program is taking place, and I listened carefully to our distinguished panelists and speakers, and I would start just to be as concrete, since only 5 minutes left, and how they say, the last but not the least, but we have the burden to be very short. I would like to connect to what Madam Elizabeth said on the project-based collaboration, which I think is a very important initiative in this area, because since we are talking about sharing experiences, sharing best experiences, and at the same time also sharing gaps and difficulties that we might face in the Western Balkans, but in particular in Albania, we have had a very profuse collaboration with other European countries in terms of run Western Balkan support, but at the same time within the project-based collaboration with the leadership of France lately, but also with the leadership of Italy and Greece last year. We had different meetings, and in a multi-agency approach, since we are talking about multi-agency approach, which somehow facilitated the work of our frontliners, but at the same time also facilitated the work of our policymakers, because we gathered from the Western Balkans and from European countries, so we saw our experiences in terms of sharing, let's say, models and gaps, not only legally speaking, but also from the police point of view, but at the same time also from the psychological and economical point of view, between what are experiences the Western Balkan countries and what is experiencing or what are experiencing some EU countries that have been facing with rehabilitation, reintegration processes, and also disengagement processes. As you know, Albania is one of those countries that has taken the accountability to rehabilitate, to repatriate, first of all, the Albanian citizens that have joined, let's say, the conflict areas of Syria and Iraq. And this has made Albania one of the say last countries to repatriate in the Western Balkans, but at the same time, this has allowed us to put in place models that now we proudly share with our neighbor countries, because we have had much more time to learn from our neighbor countries, from Kosovo, from North Macedonia, at the same time from Bosnia and Herzegovina, so also from Serbia and Montenegro. But let's say that these first three countries have been really important in terms of sharing experience with us. So we learned a lot from them. And now that we are talking together, I believe that Albania, I can proudly say that Albania is being a role model and is taking somehow the ownership of rehabilitation and reintegration processes. This not because we are a small country, but there is the ownership of the CVE Center Albania, which is an umbrella institution that guides about 7 line ministries. So from interior to justice to healthcare and social protection, education, foreign affairs, and at the same time also Ministry of Economy and Finance. And let's say putting in front of us all the objectives that we have in our national action, in our national CVE strategy, has helped us somehow to guide all these line ministries and at the same time collaborate with the civil society organizations, which has been a very profitous and a very fruitful collaboration. Because I listened to my colleagues and their experiences, and let me say to you that if we talk about prevention, if we talk about rehabilitation, reintegration, and most of all disengagement, we cannot fight this war alone. So we have to take in account the work with the religious communities. We have to take in account the work with psychologists, being them depending in our public institutions, but also freelancers. And at the same time, sometimes working with vetted, of course, vetted NGOs. I'm talking about vetted NGOs and international organizations that have helped us in this multi-agency approach that we have put in place in terms of coordination, monitoring, and at the same time supervisioning all the policies that we have had on a national level is very important. And we cannot do all this work alone. Let's say that the CVE Center, being a soft approach agency, depending from the Prime Minister's office, is a model which is so far different from other countries in the region. This has allowed us to have a policy-making, let's say, authority, but at the same time, when it is possible, we fill in the gaps and we become also managers, or we support the case management system when the child protection unit officers or the employees of the municipalities that handle all the case management systems on an integrated approach and on an interinstitutional level need our support. So every time they lack something or there is a gap to be filled, the CVE Center goes through them. That means that we monitor and we supervise, let's say, up to now, all the 29 individuals that have come back to Albania during the repatriations of October 2020 and August 2021. From this repatriation, 24 of them are children. And let me say to you that in this multi-agency approach, we have dealt with different intervention, but in particular, I would, let's say, focus on empowering the local governance institutions. is very important because when people repatriate from these conflict areas, they are, let's say, rehabilitated in ad hoc centers in order to be ready to be integrated into community and in order for the children to be ready to be integrated into schools. But this is a job, a work, a mission that cannot be fulfilled in 2 months, 3 months, or 4 months. This means that in the meantime, we have equilibrated and balanced the capacity building and let's say the basic trainings to all the first liners of that community that was going to be the hosting community for these families. One of the distinguished panelists, if I'm not wrong, Mr. Silke mentioned the fact that it is somehow difficult to understand how this integration and how rehabilitation, disengagement, or de-radicalization could happen without the support of all the institutions. And of course, this is very important because you need to consider that there is legal aid to be given to these children, and in particular, let's say, to the stateless children, which are born in the camps, in the conflict areas. But at the same time, when mothers come here, of course, they may, if there is evidence-based, they go to prison, they go to jail. But at the same time, in Albania, for example, since there was not enough strong based evidence of their, let's say, terroristic allegations, these mothers are being followed on a free status. Let's call it like that. So the investigation have not finished yet, but in order to help the rehabilitation of children, we have allowed to the mothers to go into their houses and into the community, but they are supervised from us for a year and a half up to 2 years, and they follow every step of the program that we are developing with them. The intervention, of course, cannot be made without a referral mechanism. And in Albania, we have identified the local public security councils, which are 61 municipalities. Every municipality has one, which works along with the case managers and with this integrated central approach. I could say a lot about these processes, but let's say that the most difficult thing is to coordinate. So if we talk about multi-agency approach, if we talk about interinstitutional work, coordination remains the key factor. Firstly. Secondly, the budget. We are a policy-making institution. So since we were born to make policy-making, we weren't born to be case managers. So the budget sometimes is not sufficient in order to, let's say, follow these processes in order to be successful. And if we have to measure success, like Mr. Silke said, success is measured with the passing of time. It's not measured within a month, 2 months, 3 months, or a year. I would say that after almost 2 years from the second repatriation that we had, 1 mother and 5 children, now we are measuring, let's say, the first steps of success. Now that children go regularly to school, now that children have accepted either male teachers like female teachers, now that they work independently, even if they do not have a support education teacher in the afternoon hours. So now we can say that now that the mothers are asking to us that they would like to work and make vocational programs, etc., etc. So there are some signs from which we can measure success, but I believe that we are very far from disengagement and de-radicalization. Because I believe that the process of de-radicalization has to be not only with vetted professionals that go from psychologists to psychiatrists, to social workers, and also to religious community leaders that might help these families and support them, but at the same time, they are strictly connected also with the propaganda, with what the social media, let's say, plays in place as a counter, as narratives. And we have to be able all the time to make counter narratives in order to lower the risk that these families can be again involved in such environments that can, let's say, hinder again or trigger again their radicalization, their radicalist ideas that they they have breathed within the camps. Let me conclude by saying that our mission is to coordinate, but at the same time, our mission is to build the capacities of all our frontliners, and at the same time be a connection between the central government institution to the local governance institutions, because are the services that local municipalities, that the probation services give to these people, and surround them with services without prejudices and without bias. I think this is very important. And of course, the support to a referral mechanism is important. And when we don't have 5 years' time to establish the local referral mechanism, we have to deal with the ones that we have in place by empowering them in order to pass the urgency and make possible and make sure that for the next years to come, such policies might be really efficient in order for these phenomena not to happen again. Thank you very much for your attention. I could speak even more, but I know that my colleague is waiting to speak, and so I'm stopping here. And if there will be any question, I will be happy to answer. Thanks a lot for this invitation.
Thank you very much, Lady. Indeed, we have a couple of questions, but I will wait for them and invite our colleague to contribute. Mr. Torben Adams of the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs of the Federal State of Bremen is currently seconded with the UNODC as International Program Coordinator of the Returning Foreign Fighters Detention Program. He holds a number of expert positions, such as in the Council of Europe, Council of Penological Cooperation, and the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training, CEPOL, and was co-chair of the Prisons and Probation Working Group of the Radicalization Awareness Network. He holds a master's degree in criminal justice, governance, and police science from the Ruhr University, Bochum. Torben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Daniela, for the kind introduction. Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, to start with, I would like to express my gratitude for today's intervention and invitation. The presentations were great so far. I'm very grateful. I have many pickups that far. I equally congratulate us to the Austrian Institute for International Affairs and all associated partners for this very well designed and very promising European Union funded project. We have heard earlier that the prevention of terror attacks also depends on the successful disengagement and reintegration of terrorist and extremist offenders. It is important to utilize evidence-based and effective practices, also to strengthen the cooperation among the various stakeholders. It is also advisable to introduce a solid and country-tailored risk need assessment, and we agree that a multi-agency and multidisciplinary framework is required. This project, EUTEx, starts with the ambition to develop a European framework for disengagement and reintegration of extremist offenders and radicalized individuals in prison, including returning foreign terrorist fighters and their families. This initiative, dear ladies and gentlemen, comes very timely. I have studied the project outline and the expected outcome and outputs with great interest. It was, for instance, emphasized that a massive need for training of prison and probation specialized staff is still required. I agree on that, but would like also to underscore the importance of the role of the correctional officer as well. Our uniformed staff, the frontline practitioners, are in general on duty 24/7. This is most often not the case for our specialized staff, because senior management in prison, social workers and psychologists are often, but of course not always, working from Monday to Friday on a 9-to-5 pattern. As former prison officer, I can assure you that prison happen also during the night and on the weekend. Therefore, frontline practitioners are a very, very important resource. There's also a huge difference when it comes to the quantity and quality of training for prison and probation staff. In some countries, the training to become a prison officer lasts 240 hours of induction training, while other countries train their staff for 3.5 years. Here, I would like to highlight the Council of Europe guidelines regarding recruitment, selection, education, training, and professional development of prison and probation staff in my opinion, is a very useful European product on a very important topic. We all agree that multi-agency cooperation is required to establish a holistic and mutual rehabilitation and reintegration process. Multi-agency cooperation comes to life, for example, during the transition period between prison and probation, which is a very vulnerable time in particular. Here I would like to stress that the legal framework for such multi-agency cooperation approaches is extremely important. In practice, we have often realized that multi-agency cooperation could be a one-way road. For instance, when we work as a prison administration with other law enforcement entities, for instance, the police or the domestic intelligence. In this regard, I would like to draw your attention to one European Union directive. This is the Directive 680th of the year 2016 with a long title. The title is EU Directive on the Protection of Natural Persons with regard to the processing of personal data by competent authorities for the purposes of the prevention, investigation, detection or prosecution of criminal offences or the execution of criminal penalties and on the free movement of such data. Based on this EU directive, some European Union member states have already endorsed legislation which serve as a framework for multi-agency cooperation. As a practitioner, I can assure you that this was a great deal of clarity for practitioners on when to share what information with whom. Risk need assessments are also desired and serve the aim to assess individual needs and risk of prisoners. During the last years, it seems that risk need assessment tools have transformed into a kind of silver bullet for prison administrations. In this regard, I hope that EUTEx project team will also pay attention to the disengagement interventions which have to be in place in prison. It is often a cumbersome experience for practitioners being trained to use a structural professional judgment tool, for instance, but being left alone without any useful intervention or program to address the identified risk and needs once the assessment was conducted. This was actually the case in some countries where we have trained staff on the use of risk need assessment tools, but then they realized, we don't have the required tools in order to work with the inmates. Today, I would like to assure you that the EUTEx project team can also count on the UNODC support. Within the UN system, UNODC acts as a custodian of the international standards and norms related to the treatment of prisoners. In response to member states' request, UNODC developed the first United Nations comprehensive technical guide on the management of violent extremist prisoners and the prevention of radicalization to violence in prison. Along with this handbook, UNODC has also launched key principles and recommendations on the treatment and management of violent extremist prisoners. Our key recommendations focusing on following priorities: the management of violent extremist prisoners, managing prison staff working with violent extremist prisoners, assessing and managing the risk identified, prison-based interventions and disengagement interventions, managing the implementation of the disengagement interventions, and also prevention of violent extremism in prison settings at large. In addition, I would like to flag that United Nations have developed and adopted a common position on incarceration, including a common framework for UN support to member states on incarceration-related matters. The common position firmly positions prison reform and the treatment of offenders as urgent justice and rule of law priority, and is an integral part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals and the commitment to leave no one behind. As prison practitioners, we know that prisons have much more intention compared to the early years. Even like Andrew Silk, I started my career somehow in the middle 1990s in the prison service, and prison was not mentioned in the counterterrorism strategy of the European Union or the United Nations in the 1990s. But nowadays we realize that prison matters. Dear ladies and gentlemen, please let me conclude with a rather personal note. As a former staff member of the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs in Bremen, Germany, I'm very proud that Bremen is still a consortium partner in this important project. I have also a very close professional and personal relation to colleagues from the Austrian Ministry of Justice, and in particular to the distinguished colleagues of the Austrian Correctional Service, the Justizwache in Österreich. It is great to know that many of our colleagues who are truly dedicated to making change are involved in this very promising project. Having this said, I wish all involved partners from Austria, from Sweden, Portugal, Spain, France, Romania, Albania, Kosovo, and Germany much success and a fruitful project. Thanks much for your attention. Back to you, Mrs. Chair.
Thank you very much, Torben. It's always a pleasure to listen to you as such an experienced practitioner, and also to follow up on these very critical points that you have made. We are actually coming close to the end of our session today. However, I have a number of questions I would like you to really briefly address them in perhaps less than a minute if possible, because the people made the effort of formulating them. So very briefly, is there a difference in the approaches on de-radicalization, disengagement and rehabilitation towards men and women while in prison and after release in practice? I know it should, but is it actually done?
I will thanks much for the question. I really highly value all questions. So also the participants could perhaps raise the questions later via email. I would not mind to respond. I'm not a gender specialist, but definitely female and male offenders deserve different treatment programs, and they face different issues once released from prison. Social stigma could play a different role for female offenders once released back into society. And therefore, I do believe that the transition period for female offenders has to be tailored in a different manner in order to address some of the most triggering, burning challenges once released from prison. We have, of course, with Anita Peresin, a very, very knowledgeable gender expert here in the call, but this would be my answer in a nutshell. Tailor the interventions for females prior to release to society. Over.
Thank you very much. That's how we do it. I have a more, I think, psychological question, so I'm going to address it to Andrew. How can we deal well with overvalued ideas, fixed ideas, as a cognitive disorder, thinking disorder, in which the perception of reality is distorted? So I guess considering how radicalization basically creates this kind of alternative worldview, how can you take people away from that? And I think I'm probably also thinking about, anti-vax movement, these kinds of issues, where people will just basically block and say, okay, you're part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, and that can be extremely tough to do. And I think, keeping it very brief, one area that's worth focusing on is the idea of sacred values, which some of you will have come across before. Now, sacred values, Scott Atran, the anthropologist, has kind of pushed a lot of research on this, but essentially they're not necessarily religious values, but they are values which are fundamental to the individual. And there's been some very interesting research looking at neural imaging, which shows that different parts of the brain become active when sacred values are involved. And essentially what this means is they're non-negotiable. You won't compromise on these. They're fixed. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do in that area to look at the role that sacred values play within radicalization, but also potentially in terms of disengagement and de-radicalization. At the moment, the evidence isn't promising, and it suggests that it's very, very difficult to change sacred values. Literally, it's at a neurological level. But that would be where I would direct attention now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. A last question, last minute, and I think I will address Elizabeth. It's a very tough one. But yeah, I think we also need to think from this perspective. Could we think about extremism as a failure of our current systems? And if so, what can we do about it?
Yes, that was a tricky question. I think we need to acknowledge that there are violent extremist ideologies that are there, how to say, revolutionary theories, Marxism, the violent far right has a very long history back in the day. So these are here, and there are books written and people will read them. But then, of course, there is can be a political environment that encourage these movements. or other severe challenges as wars and as the ongoing conflict now in war in Ukraine. That could be also a kind of how to say tipping point for extremism. And another thing that is important is if there is a kind of leader that appears that can collect and speak to these groups that are or these individuals that are interested, how to say. So, but as Professor Silk said, a lot of people could be interested in extremism, but a few will then go to action. The difference we saw was with the Islamic State, which managed to gather thousands of people in northeastern Syria to establish this caliphate. It was something actually new, and we also see now with the violent far right connection to the radical right movement on the internet. This is also something new we haven't seen before with this radical right extremist racist flow of ideas online. So there are kind of new challenges that we need to adapt to, and this project is maybe a result also of these challenges that we face. I hope this was kind of an answer to a very tricky question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your very valuable inputs, and we were very happy to hear about assessments, about best practices, about critical points, starting with Sweden and Albania and Spain and Croatia and the UK and Ireland, depending on where you are. And Germany, of course. We here in Austria, we're really at the beginning of this road, and we are very happy and lucky to learn from all these experiences. We would also like to keep you personally within the family of EUTEx, and we'll come back to you and keep you updated and involve you in the activities to follow. And again, very many thanks for your inputs. I wish you a great evening, and also thank you very much to the audience for the questions, and we will see you soon.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Have a nice day or evening.
Thank you. Thank you so
very
much
much to all.
Bye, everyone.